innovation will flourish. Is government rising to the challenge? Looking first to the international arena, we see that the world community, minus one very important player, has at long last agreed on a set of first steps to address climate change. As many of you know, over the summer in Bonn, Germany, 178 nations reached a tentative compromise on the rules that will allow the Kyoto Protocol to enter into force. The Kyoto Protocol, of course, is the agreement first negotiated in 1997 that requires developed countries to reduce or limit their emissions of greenhouse gases in relation to 1990 levels, with different countries agreeing to different targets. In addition to establishing targets, the Kyoto Protocol outlines how countries can achieve them, for example, by making emission reductions at home, by trading emission reduction credits with others, and by using sinks, such as farms and forests, to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Although many of the details on how these mechanisms will work still need to be decided, the compromise reached in Bonn will likely provide countries with a high degree of flexibility in how they use these various strategies. And this, I believe, is very important and a very positive development, because it will permit countries and businesses to meet their objectives in the most cost-effective ways. But the Kyoto Protocol is just a first step on what will be a long march to a less carbon-intensive world. Its initial targets for emission reductions take us only to the 2008 to 2012 period, and they represent just a very small down payment on the level of reductions that scientists say we must achieve in order to have a real effect on mitigating climate change. It is also important to note that the ultimate impact of the Kyoto Protocol will be severely limited by the United States government's decision not to be a party to the agreement. The Bush administration has said repeatedly that it believes Kyoto is fatally flawed and not acceptable to the United States. Granted, the protocol does have its problems. It is, after all, an agreement of approximately 180 countries with differing aspirations, differing economies, and differing views of the environment. But I believe that the other nations of the world, in agreeing to a compromise solution in Bonn, decided to send a message to the United States that an imperfect agreement is better than none, and that we cannot wait any longer to begin working together to solve the most important environmental issue facing the world today. The Kyoto Compromise very clearly does not amount to a solution to the problem of climate change. Rather, it is a first strong statement of purpose and will to deal with this problem, and therefore it is an essential and historic step. And what of the United States? Interestingly, in the same way that the Bush administration's rejection of Kyoto seems to have galvanized international support for the protocol, it appears to have generated new momentum on Capitol Hill to finally begin tackling the challenge of climate change. It is too early to know how the tragic events of September 11th will affect this and so many other vital issues in the months ahead. But prior to these events, there were strong indications in Congress that it was more prepared than ever to begin building the programs needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions here in the United States. It is important to note that this new support comes from both sides of the aisle. Perhaps the biggest sign of a changing climate in Congress is legislation introduced by Senator Robert Byrd of coal-producing West Virginia and Senator Ted Stevens of oil-producing Alaska. In addition to providing money for technology research, the Senator's bill would require the President to develop a climate change strategy aimed at stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Senators John McCain and Joseph Lieberman, another bipartisan team, are going even further. They have announced that they plan to introduce major legislation to require greenhouse gas reductions throughout the economy under an emissions trading system, a proven way to cut emissions cost-effectively, and one that we strongly support. What are some of the other key elements of a serious domestic program? We need first and foremost an energy policy that is climate friendly. We need policies to deal with energy-using products such as automobiles and appliances so that they use fuel more efficiently and are compatible with different non-fossil fuels. And we need a technology policy that will speed our development and diffusion of new technologies. None of this will happen overnight, but there is good reason to believe that as we approach the presidential election in 2004, the prospects will grow even stronger. And as the United States begins to demonstrate real efforts to curb its own emissions, it can credibly re-enter the international dialogue and work more closely with other nations to chart a common path forward. Which leads me to the strategy for the future that is mentioned in the title of my remarks. The strategy, in my view, is to ensure that the Kyoto Protocol stays on the road to ratification and entry into force, while the United States begins to pursue good faith domestic efforts to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. To the extent that U.S. efforts are compatible with the Kyoto framework, and I hope they will be compatible, then the world can still hold out hope that the two roads will eventually merge, yielding a truly global plan of action. Achieving that global strategy, however, will mean coming to terms with an issue that has loomed over the climate debate from the start, but has yet to be faced head-on, and that is the issue of fairness. For as the title of your colloquium, A Just and Sustainable Future, rightly suggests, this is not about sustainability alone, but justice as well. Indeed, it is hard to imagine a future that is truly sustainable unless it is also fair and just. From Rio in 1992 through Kyoto in 1997, and up to the most recent round of negotiations in Bonn, the international climate talks have proceeded on the basis of a common understanding. Developed countries must act first. This bargain of sorts, which obligates one group of countries to act with the understanding that the other group will follow, acknowledges the fundamental inequities presented by climate change. It is an undeniable fact that the developed countries account for the vast majority of the greenhouse gases put in the atmosphere over the past century, and that their per capita emissions are many times those of developing countries. The United States, for example, contributed nearly a third of worldwide emissions last century, and continues to produce roughly a quarter of global emissions, with only 4% of the world's population. But historic responsibility for climate change is just one piece of the equity equation. It is also undeniable that those least responsible, the developing countries, face a disproportionate share of the impacts of global warming, from flooding to disease to famine, while having fewer resources with which to cope. So while many in the United States, including President Bush, fault Kyoto for letting developing countries off the hook, I believe it is only fair that the developed countries act first. But I also believe that in time, the developing countries must act too. Indeed, the emission reduction efforts finally getting underway in the industrial world will be pointless unless developing countries agree in some way to restrain the rapid rise in their own emissions. It is important to recognize the steps already being taken by developing countries. Measures such as market reforms and energy efficiency improvements, while more often motivated by concerns other than climate change, are in fact resulting in significant emission savings. China, for example, cut carbon dioxide emissions by more than 10% over the last 5 years. But far more effort is needed. In a series of reports looking at electric power in developing countries, the Pew Center found that emissions from that sector alone will triple by 2020 under a business-as-usual scenario. However, we also found that efficiency improvements and the introduction of low-emission technologies could cut this increase in half while maintaining economic growth. Once again, technology is absolutely critical. Arriving at a truly global strategy, then, will require a fundamental rethinking of the approach taken so far. The straightforward target set by Kyoto, cutting each country's emissions by an agreed percentage, will hopefully succeed in starting industrialized countries on the right path. But a framework that encompasses both developed and developing countries and fairly apportions responsibility among them will have to be more sophisticated. It will have to accommodate the legitimate desire of developing countries to raise their living standards. It will have to recognize that different countries face very different challenges. For developed countries, the challenge is converting from the existing energy infrastructure to a clean one. While for the developing countries, it is much more a matter of building the infrastructure right in the first place. An effective global strategy will also have to mobilize the flow of technology, know-how, and resources from wealthier nations so that poorer countries are in a position to keep up their end of the bargain. In that sense, Our challenge is to ensure not only that the new industrial revolution is launched, but also that its fruits are shared quickly and fairly. These are my thoughts on where we stand in our effort to spare future generations the grave risks of an overheated planet. Enormous challenges lie ahead, but there are promising signs, both internationally and here in the United States, that we are at last mustering the will to begin confronting them. We must seize on that momentum and keep moving forward. Thank you. Let's see, what do I do now? Do I stand here? Do I take questions?
Go ahead and take questions right now. I think they're just going to answer that. Since we have limited time, I would ask if you do ask questions, so everybody can get a question in and not just make statements. But if you'd like to ask a question, why don't you go ahead and choose who you want to talk to, and I'll do the Eileen Claussen task already. Does anybody like to ask a question?
Can't be that I answer them all.
I'll start with one then. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's interesting. When we don't have mandates in place, why do we have 36 multinational corporations working now to reduce greenhouse gases?
I mean, I think actually there are a variety of reasons, and it's probably worth paying attention to all of them. I think the management and all of these corporations believe that this is a serious issue and that they have some responsibility both for what is happening now and for what might happen in the future. I think they're all convinced that at some point there will be a system put in place globally and nationally, and they'd like a seat at the table so that they can have some influence on the policy. Some of these companies are looking at the technologies for the future and trying to figure out their investments, and so some of them have some interest in making sure that we respond in a reasonable way to this. Some people sort of have part of their image as being sort of sustainable companies or companies that are sensitive to these issues, and they believe that that is good business, and so that is another reason for wanting to do this. So I mean, I think there are a whole wide range of reasons. None of these companies is the same as any other, and it's really a question of sort of deciding which ones are where. My interest is in making sure they do the right things and advocate the right policies. So I guess I don't get into their motives as much as I get into their actions.
A question is, you mentioned percentage reductions, 3.5%, 30%. As there are goals of growth, using America as an example, but there are goals across the world. How do these reductions play in actual reductions in a global environment if we do continue to look for economic growth, industrial growth, and population growth around the world?
I mean, I think that the challenge is not to grow, it's how to grow cleanly. And I think that does require major changes in technology. That's the only way. So if you were looking at what you might need to actually stabilize concentrations, you're actually talking about reducing from current levels by maybe 70%. So the challenge is huge. These gases stay up in the atmosphere for a very long time. No matter what we do in the short term, we've actually bought a fair amount of global warming with all the impacts that we get from that. On the other hand, we're not going to sort of turn off all the faucets of the economy to deal with this. And so I mean, the challenge is to introduce new technologies, to move toward cleaner products, and to start moving now so you can actually turn the curve a little bit, and then as the technologies become more readily available and become more cost competitive, start going on the downward path. But there's a huge distance to go. And you also have to think about here the developing countries who are going to develop. I mean, we may want to keep growing at a certain percentage a year. Those countries have huge development needs. If we don't actually start having cleaner development there. We fought gold for several centuries, and the kinds of impacts we're talking about over that time frame are much greater than the kinds that we can now sort of quantify, let's say, the next 100 years.
Related to that, do the economic numbers, do they relate at all to the biosphere and the ability to assimilate what is being produced and what will be
Yes,
produced?
yes. And when I said 70 to 80%, that's sort of what we're talking about. Yes.
Were you disappointed that the most recent presidential elections didn't have the environment as a central issue? And corollary to that is obviously they weren't, and why do you think that was the case?
I think most Americans view themselves as environmentalists, but I also think if you ask them what the 10 issues are that are most important to them, environment may be 8, 9, or 10, but not in the top few. And I think candidates in elections respond to what they think the public cares most about. So I don't think there was a sense that this issue or environment generally was that high a priority for the American public, in part because I don't think the American public makes that point to politicians running for election. So on the other hand, they all think everybody thinks they're an environmentalist, but somehow or other it's sort of separate from their everyday actions, their everyday tasks, and even how they vote. So yeah, I'm disappointed that it wasn't an issue. I'm disappointed that this issue in particular didn't get very much play, although it got a tiny bit. It wasn't a very stimulating debate or a very thoughtful way of trying to come to grips with it either.
Well, as someone who sat in this very room about 26 years ago as an undergraduate, listening to Avery Clemens talk about the urgent need to change the direction of our energy economy, I'm very glad to hear that you're confident and optimistic that we're maybe getting on the right course finally. I'm confident that you're close to the issue and that your optimism is well founded. I guess my question is a more technical question. There's been some debate lately